My name is Josie Callahan, and for the last 6 years I've made my living traveling alone. I run a small travel channel, the kind that pays for flights and not much else, and in that time I've slept in over 200 guest houses, hostels, night trains, and rented rooms across 4 continents. Most of those nights were unremarkable in the best possible way, the kind of forgettable comfort that comes from a soft pillow and a locked door and nothing more complicated than jet lag keeping you awake. But 3 of them weren't, and I've never told all 3 of these stories back to back, in order until tonight, because it wasn't until I laid them next to each other, months apart in different countries, that I noticed the thing connecting them, the thing that still keeps me checking hotel room locks twice before I sleep. Even in cities where nothing has ever gone wrong, these are 3 true travel horror stories. And I want to tell you up front that none of them end the way you're expecting. I'm not going to give you a monster. I'm not going to give you blood on a wall. What I'm going to give you is 3 ordinary trips that quietly, patiently turned into something I still don't have a name for. And by the time we get to the 3rd one, I think you'll understand exactly why I couldn't sleep the night I finally noticed what all 3 had in common. I've told pieces of these stories before, scattered across old videos and half-finished travel vlogs, but never side by side, never in the order they actually happened, because it took years before I trusted the pattern enough to say it out loud. If stories like this are the kind that keep you up thinking long after the video ends, go ahead and subscribe to Eerie Atma's X now, because I promise you, the connection between these 3 trips is worse than any single one of them on its own. The first story happened when I was 24, backpacking through northern Vietnam during my first real solo trip, the kind you take when you're young enough to believe caution is something other people need. I'd found a guest house outside Sapa through a paper flyer taped to a hostel corkboard in Hanoi, a family-run place tucked into the terraced hills. No website, no reviews, just a phone number and a hand-drawn map. The owner was a woman named Madame Lin, small and quick-moving, with the kind of directness that made me trust her immediately. She showed me to a room on the 2nd floor, wooden shutters, a single bed with a mosquito net, the smell of wood smoke drifting up from the kitchen below. Before she left me that first night, she asked for my name, which wasn't unusual. Guest houses need it for the register, but she asked twice. My real name, she said, the 2nd time, watching my face carefully as she said it. I laughed and told her Josie was in fact my real name, and she nodded slowly, satisfied, and wrote it into a leather-bound guest book that looked older than the building itself. Then she told me something I wrote off, at the time, as a charming piece of local superstition. Don't answer if someone knocks after midnight and doesn't say your name first, she said. If they knock and just wait, don't open the door. Wait for them to say it? I remember laughing again, a little uneasy this time, and asking her what would happen if I didn't wait. She just shook her head and told me to sleep well, and closed the door behind her. The first 2 nights were exactly what I'd hoped the trip would be. Mist rolling through the valley in the mornings, the terraced rice fields catching gold light in the evenings, the kind of silence at night that city people forget exists, broken only by insects and, occasionally, a rooster confused about the hour. I didn't think about Madame Lin's warning again until the 3rd night. When I woke to a knock on my door at some hour I couldn't identify, the kind of deep, dreamless dark where your phone battery has already died and you have no way of checking the time. The knock was soft. 3 light taps, evenly spaced, patient in a way that unsettled me more than urgency would have. I lay still, heart picking up, waiting the way you wait for a second sound to to confirm the first wasn't your imagination. Another 3 taps, and then, very quietly, on the other side of that thin wooden door, I heard my name. Josie. Not shouted, not questioning. Said the way you'd say a name you already knew, low and certain, almost bored. I sat up in the dark, my mosquito net catching against my shoulder, and I did the thing Madame Lynn had told me to do. I answered. I said yes, and asked who was there. Silence. A long, total silence, the kind that makes you aware of your own breathing. Then footsteps, slow and unhurried, moving away down the hall. Down what I later learned was a staircase that led only to a locked storage room. Not to any other guest quarters, not to any exit at all. In the morning, I asked Madame Lynn, as casually as I could manage, whether one of the other guests had come looking for me during the night. She looked at me for a long moment before answering, and told me there were no other guests staying at the guest house that week. I was, she said, the only one. Before I left the breakfast table that morning, I asked if I could look through the old guest book, the one she'd written my name into on the first night, telling her I collected stamps and signatures from the places I stayed, which wasn't entirely a lie, just not the real reason I wanted to see it. She hesitated, then set it in front of me and went back to the kitchen. I flipped through pages, going back years, names in a dozen languages, dates spanning what must have been decades of travelers passing through that same wooden building. And scattered through those pages, every so often, a name would appear with a single small mark beside it, a short horizontal line drawn in the same ink as the entry itself, never explained, never repeated on every page, just occasionally, unpredictably, beside a handful of names among hundreds. I didn't think much of it at the time, beyond a passing curiosity, the kind of detail you notice and then let slide as you close the book and hand it back. It wasn't until much later, back home, that I understood what that mark most likely meant, and by then I had no way of knowing whether my own name, 3 nights into that stay, had ever been marked the same way. I asked her, then, what would have happened if I hadn't answered, if I'd simply stayed silent and waited. She didn't answer right away. When she finally did, she said only that the knocking would have continued until I did, softer each time, and that eventually, if I'd stayed silent long enough, it would have said my name from inside the room instead of outside the door. I left 2 days early. I told myself it was because the trail conditions had changed. It wasn't. The second story happened 4 years later, on an overnight train crossing from Belgrade toward the Adriatic coast, a route I'd chosen specifically because of the online reputation those trains had for being cramped, ancient, and slightly unpredictable, the kind of experience my viewers loved hearing about. I was sharing a 6-berth sleeper compartment with an older couple, a college student heading home, and one empty berth that stayed empty the entire trip, at least as far as I initially understood, somewhere past midnight. With the couple asleep and the student gone to smoke between cars, a man I hadn't noticed boarding sat down across from me in the narrow aisle seat, folding his coat neatly over his knees. He looked ordinary, mid-50s, tired eyes, the kind of face you forget within minutes of looking away from it. He asked, in accented but fluent English, whether I was the woman traveling alone with the blue backpack who'd missed her connection in Belgrade that afternoon due to a delayed regional bus from the south. I had missed exactly that connection, for exactly that reason, and I hadn't mentioned it to a single person on that train. I asked him how he knew that, and he smiled in a way that didn't quite reach the rest of his face, and told me that people who travel alone leave a shape behind them, a pattern other travelers learn to notice if they pay close enough attention. It was a strange, almost poetic answer, and at the time I filed it under eccentric stranger making conversation, the kind of thing that happens on night trains all over the world. I glanced toward the older couple across the compartment once, half expecting them to stir at the sound of our conversation, but they slept on undisturbed, the woman's head resting against her husband's shoulder, both of them breathing in that particular deep rhythm of people who trust the space they're in. Something about their stillness, the completeness of it, made the man's presence across from me feel even less anchored to the ordinary logic of a shared sleeper car. We talked for a while after that, nothing alarming, just travel small talk, the sort of exchange you have a dozen times in a single backpacking trip. But somewhere in that conversation, he mentioned offhandedly that I should be careful in the next city on my route, a small coastal town I hadn't told him I was heading toward, a stop that wasn't printed on my visible ticket, tucked into a connection I'd booked separately just that afternoon. When I asked how he knew my next stop, he simply said that it was written on me, the way a person's next move is sometimes written on their face before they've decided anything at all. I laughed it off, the way you do when unease hasn't yet crossed into fear, and eventually excused myself to try to sleep, my back turned to the aisle, my day pack pulled tight against my chest, the way solo travelers learn to sleep. When I woke somewhere near the coast, the man was gone. So was his coat, his seat cushion undisturbed. No sign anyone had sat there at all. I asked the college student, back from his cigarette break hours earlier, whether he'd noticed the man who'd been sitting in the aisle seat across from me. He said with a particular confusion of someone answering a question that doesn't match his memory, that the aisle seat had been empty the entire night. He'd been awake for most of it, unable to sleep on the rocking train, and no one, he was certain, had sat there at all. I want to pause here and tell you something honestly. I still don't know what to make of that second story on its own. A missed connection is easy enough information to overhear somewhere in a station. A next destination could, in theory, have been visible on paperwork I wasn't careful enough to hide. I spent years telling myself some rational version of that night, the kind of story you build so you can keep traveling without flinching at every stranger who sits down near you. It was only later, laying this story beside the first one, that the rational version stopped holding together. There's one more detail from that train I left out, because for a long time I didn't trust my own memory of it enough to include it. Just before the man stood to leave, or however he left, since I never actually saw him go, he reached into his coat and set something small on the fold-down table between us. A plain white card with nothing printed on it except a single short line, the same length and weight as the mark I'd later find scattered through Madame Lin's guest book, though I didn't make that connection until much later. I picked it up, turned it over, found nothing on the back, and when I looked up to ask him what it meant, the seat across from me was already empty. I kept that card in the front pocket of my day pack for the rest of the trip, and somewhere between the coast and my flight home, it was simply gone, and I have never been able to say with certainty whether I lost it or whether it left on its own. The third story is the one I think about the most, because it's the one where I finally understood I wasn't collecting three unconnected strange nights. I was collecting one long thread, pulled tight across years and continents, and something on the other end of it had been holding steady the entire time. 2 years ago, I was hiking a remote stretch of the Scottish Highlands, staying in a small stone bothy a local guide had recommended. Days from the nearest proper town, the kind of silence up there that has weight to it, broken only by wind moving across heather and the distant, occasional call of some bird I never identified. The guide, a weathered man named Fergus, who'd walked those hills his entire life, dropped me at the trailhead with unusually specific instructions. Stay on the marked path after dark. Don't answer if you hear your name called from off the trail, not until you've called back and heard it repeated exactly the same way twice. If it changes even slightly, don't answer at all, I asked him, half joking by then, whether that was the same superstition I'd have heard back in Vietnam or somewhere along the Balkan coast. Some universal traveler's warning passed hand to hand across cultures that had never touched each other. He looked at me for a long moment, the wind pulling at his collar, and said he had no idea what I meant, that this particular caution belonged only to these hills, and had for as long as anyone could remember. The first night was uneventful, cold and clear stars in a density I'd rarely seen. The bothy's single window framing a black hillside, broken only by the pale scar of the marked trail. I slept well, or well enough, waking twice to the sound of wind pressing against the stone walls, and once to something that might have been a sheep somewhere in the dark, distant and unbothered. The second night began the same way, a fire built low in the small hearth. The smell of peat smoke settling into my clothes, my boots drying by the door. The particular tiredness that comes from a full day of walking, making the stone floor feel almost comfortable. It was well after dark, the fire down to embers, when I heard my name called from somewhere off the marked path, carried faintly on the wind, low and certain, exactly the way it had sounded on the other side of that door in Vietnam years before. I did what Fergus told me. I called back and waited. My name came again, low, unhurried, from slightly further off than before. I called back a second time, listening carefully the way he'd instructed, comparing the sound in my memory the way you'd compare two notes played on the same instrument. The second time, it wasn't quite the same. A fraction off. A syllable stretched half a second longer than it should have been. The kind of difference you'd only notice if you'd spent years training yourself to listen for exactly that discrepancy. I didn't answer a third time. I sat in that bothy with my back against the stone wall, my headlamp off to save the battery, and because some instinct told me that light might matter less than silence right then, and I listened to my own name called 4 more times over the next hour, each time slightly different from the last, testing variations the way someone might test a key in a lock they didn't quite have the shape of yet. By morning, it had stopped entirely, and I hiked out at first light without waiting for my planned second day on that trail. Fergus met me at the pickup point earlier than we'd arranged, and when I told him what had happened, he didn't look surprised. He asked only one question. He asked whether it had gotten my name right even once, and all those attempts. It hadn't. Not once, not exactly. And when I told him that, something in his shoulders eased just slightly. The way a person relaxes when a test comes back the way they'd hoped rather than the way they'd feared. Here's the detail I only put together months later. Back home, scrolling through old trip journals for an unrelated video. In Vietnam, whatever knocked on my door said my name once and got it exactly right, and I answered. On the train, the stranger never said my name at all, only facts around it, close enough to unsettle without ever crossing the line into the one word that would have confirmed something I still can't fully articulate. And in Scotland, whatever called from off the trail tried my name 7 times and never once landed on it correctly. And because of that single unbroken failure, I walked away from that hillside completely unharmed. I went back through Madame Lin's guest book in my memory, piecing together what little I could recall of the names marked with that small horizontal line, and I realized with the kind of cold clarity that settled into my chest and stayed there for weeks, that every single one of them belonged to guests who, according to a handwritten note on the guesthouse's community board, had never checked out, never contacted anyone afterward, simply vanished from every record except that single mark in a book meant for tourists collecting stamps and signatures. I don't know how many of those names had answered the way I did to something that already knew exactly how to say them. I don't know how many of them are still traveling somewhere, or whether that's even the right question to ask. 3 different countries, 3 different cultures, 3 different sets of local warnings, 3 strangers who each, in their own language and their own tradition, seemed to understand the exact same underlying rule, one I still can't explain and have never found written down anywhere outside the mouths of people who live closest to wherever this thing operates. Something out there in enough places to make coincidence feel like the least likely explanation is trying to learn your name, not find it. Learn it the way you'd learn a password, testing it against you the way a key is tested against a lock. And the only real difference between the 3 nights that shaped this video is how close each attempt came to getting it exactly right. I think about the first story most when I'm falling asleep in unfamiliar rooms now, because in that one, whatever it was already had my name correct, already knew exactly how to say it, and the only choice left in my hands was whether to answer at all. I think about the second story when I'm sitting near strangers on long overnight journeys, wondering how much of what feels like a stranger's uncanny observation is actually something closer, more patient, more familiar with my movements than any stranger should be. And I think about the third story on nights when I hear my name called from somewhere I can't quite place, because now I know to listen for the flaw, the fraction of a second that's wrong before I ever open my mouth to answer back. I've thought a great deal in the years since Scotland about why the pattern seems to hold the way it does, why getting a name exactly right seems to matter so much more than simply knowing it. I don't have an answer I trust enough to share as fact, only a theory I turn over on long flights when sleep won't come. Names, I've come to believe, are one of the only things travelers carry that were given to us by someone else entirely. Spoken first by a parent or a grandmother in a hospital room years before we ever left home, shaped by a voice and an intention that has nothing to do with wherever we happen to be standing now. Maybe that's exactly why it matters so much to whatever is doing the asking. Maybe a name said perfectly is a kind of permission, a door held open by something only you could have given away, and a name said almost right is simply a door that never quite opens. No matter how many times someone knocks on the other side of it, I still travel constantly. I haven't stopped and I don't plan to, because the alternative, staying home and letting 3 strange nights dictate the rest of my life, feels like its own kind of loss. But I travel differently now. I keep my full name off every guest book I can avoid signing. I wear headphones I'm not actually listening to on overnight trains, just so strangers assume I can't hear whatever they might say. And I've learned, the hard way, exactly how many times to listen before I ever open my mouth to answer something calling to me. From somewhere in the dark, what would you have done? Lying awake in that Vietnamese guest house, hearing your own name spoken low and certain on the other side of a door that led to nowhere else. Would you have answered the way I did, or would you have stayed silent and found out what came next? I still don't know, honestly, which choice was the right one. And I'm not sure there's a version of this story where both choices lead somewhere safe. If these 3 nights kept you looking a little more carefully at strangers on your next trip, or listening a little more closely the next time someone calls your name from somewhere you can't quite see. Share this with someone who travels alone, the kind of person who needs a reason to double-check a lock before they sleep in an unfamiliar room. 6 months ago, on a trip through northern Portugal, staying in a small rented room above a shuttered bakery, tucked into a narrow street that smelled faintly of yeast even hours after the ovens had gone cold, I heard 3 soft knocks on my door well past midnight. I lay still the way I always do now, blanket pulled to my chin, eyes open in the dark, and waited for whatever came next to say my name. It didn't. Not that night. It just knocked once more, waited a long moment in a silence that felt almost patient, almost willing to try again some other time, and then it stopped. I lay awake until the gray light of early morning found its way through the shutters, listening to the ordinary sounds of a city waking up below. Delivery trucks, a shopkeeper rolling up a metal gate, and I have not stayed in an unfamiliar room since without listening. Every single night for exactly 2 things: a knock or my name. And some nights lying in the dark in a city I don't know well enough yet to trust, I find myself wondering which one I'd rather hear first.